a lot of interest in the industry. So I hope we are able to cover any of the questions that you may have once Chris goes through the detailed review later on. But I just wanted to welcome you all, and then just run through a bit of background and a bit of context so you know about the tool before we actually deep dive into the methodology in the tool. So for those who don't know me, I'm Simon Brook. I work for Electricity Northwest in the DSO team, and I was the product lead for the evaluation methodology and tool last year, which is when it kicked off, and I'm continuing on this year and possibly the year after as well, because we absolutely see that the methodology and the tool is an ongoing development. Can you move to the next slide, please, Annie? Great. So in 2019, there was lots of questions about how the DNOs were evaluating the options of traditional reinforcement and flexibility. And there was a number of workshops held, both with Ofgem and then within the DNOs, to try and understand the different approaches that were applied by the DNOs. And at the time, there was a recognition that there was no common approach that was being applied. So as part of the open networks, it was decided that we would create a common approach, common methodology. And in 2020, we issued a PID, which had this product one under the workstream 1A, the flexibility services workstream. And the scope of what we set out to do is in the blue box on the right-hand side of this slide. The first task for the product team was to find a consultancy that would help us create that common methodology. And I was pleased to say that Baringa were successful and brought on board. And then the product team and Baringa spent several months then reviewing all of the known methodologies in GB and around the world that we use for how do you evaluate what your various investment options are, including particularly flexibility. And we had lots of intensive sessions just to work out what the methodology should be, lots of detailed discussions. And towards the end of May and June, we were then start extensively looking at how we would engage with various parties to explain the proposed methodology that we had. And we did quite a lot of extensive engagement with people to provide them an update of where we were in our development process for a methodology, but more in particular really is to actually make sure that they understood it and provide us feedback about whether we had the right detail of the methodology. So we went to the advisory group, we spoke with Ofgem separately. In the summer of last year, we had a section as part of the flexibility consultation, and all of those engagements proved really useful, got lots of really good feedback and lots of questions. And if you've been following the programme, you'll see how the methodology and our responses, or how we responded to all of your comments and how the methodology was amended accordingly. Pleased to say that when we got to the end of last year, that we published both what we are calling the baseline common evaluation methodology, the tool, and then lots of associated material like a user guide and a set of use cases and a how-to video. All of them are on the ENA website for you to look at it, and we're going to deep dive later on in this session with Chris on the actual tool itself. Can you move to the next slide, please, Annie? So, common question is, what is the common evaluation methodology and tool? And as I said, it is that methodology, a common methodology that all the DNOs can use to evaluate those flex and non-flex options that they possibly be faced with when they are considering how to develop their network. We've identified that, well, when we originally started, the aim was that the tool would do the evaluation of flexibility against traditional reinforcement, but we realized that the tool actually can be used to look at other non-flexible options like energy efficiency and active network management. And the website holds a number of use cases which pick up those other non-flex options. I need to just that the tool itself is based on an Excel model of Ofgem's ED1 costs and benefits analysis tool that they issued as part of ED1. So when you open it and have a look at it, if you're familiar with the Ofgem CBA template, that you'll see that it looks and feels, fairly similar because we set it out in a fairly similar format. But one really important aspect is the tool is only really to be used by the DNOs because it only looks at the costs and benefits of from a DNO perspective when it's looking at all the various options. And that's a really important point. I suspect we'll come back to this point, maybe when Chris is going through his session, maybe some questions around it. But what the tool does for the DNOs, it actually looks at the various options and tests them against different strategies, against different loading scenarios. So you can put in up to 10 different loading scenarios. So you get a really good idea about how your strategies or how your options will fare against different loading scenarios. And there's a really useful section that provides loads of insights. There is lots of financial analysis that is provided by the tool that helps us helps the DNOs make decisions. So you can go to the next slide, please, Annie. So looking forward, for this year, we are putting the common evaluation methodology in the tool under open governance within the Open Networks project, and we are setting up a user forum. So we've been discussing with the advisory group under Open Networks what the arrangement should be for open governance, and we intend to go back with a more detailed review following their comments in May. Some of you may have seen already at the beginning of April that we had a press release that indicated that the tool now is live and will be operated by all the DNOs from the 1st of April, which is great news that it's now starting to be used in anger. And as we get towards July, when we're expecting to start the user forum and its ongoing development, so that's the ongoing development of the methodology and the tool, we'll be seeking nominations for participants for the user forum. And that's probably going to be coming out maybe mid to late spring. So I suspect May, maybe late May, early June, we'll be looking for nominations. So I ask you to look out for that. That's really quite important. Can you move to the next slide, please, Annie? So what we're going to do now is we're going to move over to Chris, and Chris is going to do a detailed run through using a worked example. Mary and I will be looking for comments, any questions, any queries through Chris's discussion, and we'll probably stop if there's some things that are probably easy to answer there and then. We'll find the appropriate time to flag up to Chris and he can answer the questions directly. Otherwise, if anyone does put any comments in, we'll just some complex questions or comments, we'll leave them to the Q&A the following session after Chris. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand you over to Chris now. I'm hopefully going to come on screen, Chris, with the tool.
Thanks very much, Simon. Let's try a screen share and hopefully you will be able to see what is a web page. So I just wanted to point out where all the examples I'm going to show come from. So as Simon mentioned, all of this material is on the ENA's website. You just need to go to the resource library, and the easiest thing is to search for common evaluation methodology, and all the materials associated with this tool and the work running up to it will be there. And I've deliberately taken the use cases directly from this site. So all the numbers you will see should correspond to the numbers that you would download if you went here, just so that it's as easy to compare as possible. On that website, there is a blank template tool that you can that DNOs can populate themselves. But for the purposes of this demonstration, it probably is easier to work through a worked example. And again, as Simon mentioned, there are multiple use cases for this tool. to use flexibility to do different things in lieu of conventional reinforcement, or to consider A&M options. For the majority of the next, I think we have about 40 minutes to go through the tool. For the majority of that, I think we're going to go through what we're calling use case 1. And a lot of the tool is designed with this use case primarily in mind. But what we will then do is just take a shorter run through how the tool can then be used for a slightly different variant, in this case, the active network management example, just so you can get a feel for how the DNOs may be tweaking the tool or using it in a slightly different way to address different questions. So starting with use case 1, again, just for context. So this use case imagines that the DNOs are looking to use flexibility to reduce, mitigate, avoid the need for conventional reinforcement or conventional network solutions. So typically we're talking about a trade-off between paying for flexibility on an ongoing basis versus doing something like upfront capital reinforcement. So that might be network reinforcement, but it could be something similar. There are different ways of lots of different questions can be answered, but that's the primary use case that we're looking for. So I'm literally going to walk you through tab by tab. So it's going to be quite detailed. If you do want to get into more detail on any one of the tabs, there is a user guide associated with this tool. It's on the website, but it's also embedded in the tool itself. So if you double click here, that should bring up the user guide, and that user guide is aligned to the tabs in the tool. And it should give you sufficient detail to understand how the DNOs are going to populate this. Before I go tab by tab, I think it's just worth restating what Simon said, that this is a tool designed to help the DNOs understand their position when procuring flexibility versus doing conventional reinforcement. So it all reflects their costs, their incentives, their risks. It doesn't consider the costs or benefits to third parties who are using the network. So I think it's just worth being clear about that. The other thing to say is that, as well as being an evaluation tool, the purpose of this whole process is not only to give an answer at the end, but to be as transparent about the process by which the DNOs are thinking through their evaluation of flexibility. So there's quite a few places within the tool where there's an opportunity for the DNOs to document their assumptions, their thinking, the way that the problem has been set up. And that's as much for them as anybody else who may want to evaluate how that decision making is happening. Okay, enough preamble. Let's go through the tool. So to start with, you have just a guidance tab, which just gives you, it's a menu for what's going to happen in the subsequent sections. So I will just talk us through what the structure of the model is using this tab. So we have inputs and we have outputs. Simple enough. And then we have some background calculations. You only really need to worry about the inputs and the outputs, but just so you're aware, the background calculations, as Simon alluded to, are primarily based on the Ofgem's approved template that was devised for ED1. So whilst there's lots going on at the front end to help the DNOs populate in a consistent way, the actual mechanics of how the financial calculations are done is extremely or perfectly consistent with the ED1 regulatory treatment for the DNOs. And we can have a quick look at what that tab looks like. But if you've seen that template before, you will recognize those tabs, and that's very much deliberate. In terms of the inputs, what we're putting in really is a series of costs and or volumes associated with what we're calling a baseline reinforcement scenario, and then a corresponding equivalent set of inputs relating to the flexibility solution that you're putting in. There's a couple of different ways of doing that, which we'll go through. There's then a tab that describes any incentives and penalties that are relevant to the DNO. We'll look at that in detail. So again, that relates to in this case, the current price control period, but that can be updated for future price controls. There's a set of fixed inputs, which are a variety of things, but ranging from absolute constants, but also things relating to a particular DNO's final determinations for their price control period. There's a place to put down some workings. So these aren't pre-populated. This is where assumptions are being made. This is where a record can be kept. And that's it in terms of the inputs. And then in terms of the outputs, you have a series of benefits and then some additional insights and reporting to help the DNOs think through what the tool is saying, and particularly how to make a decision under the uncertainty of what the future looks like. And that will make more sense when we go through it. Okay, I'm going to click through. So the purpose of the CBA, so to be clear, this is the place where a DNO will populate the specific purpose for this specific CBA. So there may be a specific substation that is at risk of needing reinforcement, and they are considering whether to use flexibility in that case. This would be a place just to document what that thinking is, why the idea of that substation, maybe the flexibility solutions that are being considered, just so that when somebody picks this up after the fact, they can see what's gone in. So that's sort of part of the good practice that went into the thinking behind this. There is now a control tab. There's a fair amount going on here, but this is sort of where you are setting up the tool for all the subsequent steps. So there's some obvious things like what the reference year is, what the start year of the model is. Perhaps one of the biggest innovations in this tool versus what existed before is that we do, as Simon said, have the ability to look at multiple scenarios simultaneously. And actually, you can look at up to 10 different load growth scenarios. So for the time being, we have what used to be the FES scenarios named here. Those aren't necessarily the scenarios that would go into a real world use of this tool. They're just placeholders for now. So you have scenarios. So those are describing how the network's going to evolve, and in particular, in this use case, how the load is going to evolve on the network. So, for example, there may be, under your best view, you may see that the substation in question is going to require reinforcement in 2 years, but depending on how load growth evolves, that requirement for reinforcement may come about sooner, or it may come around later, and that's important to recognize that there is uncertainty in there. And what this tool allows you to do is to look at conventional reinforcement and flexibility under all those scenarios simultaneously. It also lets you look at different strategies simultaneously. So you may have a flexibility strategy versus doing nothing, taking some sort of risk, or doing different types of flexibility. You can compare up to 10 strategies or up to 10 scenarios or combinations thereof. And that's up to the DNOs how to explore that uncertainty there. There's a few other inputs I might come back to, but there's detail, and again, it is in the user guide if you do want to get into that detail. So once you've defined how many scenarios you're looking at, you need to put some inputs for each of those. So we're going to leave it as 5 different scenarios and 1 different strategy. So what we're effectively saying is we're going to compare using flexibility versus the baseline reinforcement scenario, and we're going to do that for 5 different scenarios, and that's what this tool is going to do. Just for anyone trying to use it themselves, once you've defined your scenarios, you'll just need to you update these configurations, and that will all that does is hide various rows that aren't necessary, so that it's easier to see what's going on. So you should see that now we've got our 5 scenarios here. Best view, 2 degrees, community renewables, consumer revolution, and steady progression. Again, don't worry too much about the absolute numbers. These are just dummy numbers to illustrate what's going on, and they don't necessarily correspond to the reality of these scenarios. What the DNO will then do is put in a low growth projection that corresponds to each one of these scenarios. And it's worth just emphasizing there is quite a lot of manual entry associated with this tool. So whilst the tool structures the thinking, it doesn't get around the fact that things like low growth projections need to come from a separate tool relating to the scenario development that the DNOs will have to do. Nevertheless, once that's done, they plug them in here. And what this effectively is really trying to get out is when and to what extent a particular substation or network area is overloaded by scenario. So, for example, what this is saying, for a substation that has a capacity of 30 MVA by 2023, in 4 out of 5 scenarios, that substation starts to become the peak load exceeds the capacity of that network. So some kind of intervention is required. And under the baseline, there is an assumption that there is some expenditure in order to make sure that by 2023 that substation is reinforced. So this is your kind of conventional plan, that you do some work ahead of the expected decedents. And that costs you some money, and that's effectively capital expenditure. So this is the baseline, the baseline strategy, which is to reinforce the network. And what we're then going to do is compare that approach with flexibility. So I'm just going to move on to the flexibility tab. There's actually 2 different flexibility tabs depending on how you want to populate it, but I think probably won't go into that detail. But just so you're aware, there is on the control tab, you can put in flexibility either in directly as costs or as volumes and prices, and depending on how you have the information, how you're modeling your network as a DNO, you may have a preference for one or the other. But it's probably easier to understand with the volumes and the costs associated with flexibility as we have on this tab. Okay, so
Chris.
Yes.
Do you want to pause there? I've got a couple of questions that's probably worth covering off now.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question, could the tool be used at any network layer or scale in principle, say evaluating CBA across an entire local authority area? For example, say a local authority had a policy on widespread flex investment.
In principle, this tool can be used at any scale, but I think if you're trying to look at strategically across a whole network area, it's not probably the best tool for doing that. So I'm talking in terms of a substation in this case. It could certainly be multiple substations in a local area, and you're deciding on using flexibility versus reinforcement if you can define all the costs associated with each of those options. I think for that strategic view, it's probably not the best tool to use. It may be that the whole system model, which we also developed with the ENA, is more suited to that way of thinking. But it's certainly something you could do to some extent, but it's probably not ideal for that. Sorry, that's a bit of
I would
answer.
back that up. I'd back that up as well, Chris.
Okay.
It works really, really well on a project by project basis. It can be amended to do a program, but it depends how complex that program is going to be. And I think if it was a network-wide program, I think there's possibly too many moving parts that would make it quite complex to evaluate.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it is a decision-making tool. So it's intended that this tool be used when a decision has to be taken about how an intervention is required, and there's a decision to be made about what the best intervention is. And I think that's probably the best way of using the tool.
We've got one more, Chris, and then we can move on.
Sure.
How do the FES scenario assumptions, which are GB-wide, then relate to decisions about reinforcement at a substation level? Is there a spatial element to this? Maybe you can explain this later. And I think it's probably worth going back to the point that you made about it can be any scenario, not FES scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there is obviously a whole separate exercise, which is how to define distribution FES by DNO and whatever local granularity is appropriate. This model doesn't mind what the inputs are, but you just need to define it in the appropriate terms. And yes, it could certainly be different scenario inputs as far as this tool is concerned.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we when we were kind of initially debating the scenarios and how we wanted to kind of frame them, because there was a lot of activity happening at the various DNOs on the DFES, using some of the same names as the FES, so that might be slightly misleading, because the idea is that this is a guide that says you can use a number of scenarios that you define. It might be your distribution FES, which might mean different things across the different DNOs, but it allows you as the individual DNO to set which scenarios assumptions you're using.
Yeah.
Okay, back to you, Chris.
Okay. So we've talked about the assumptions that went into the baseline reinforcement, so the upfront cost associated with reinforcing and the timing when that reinforcement is required. In terms of the flexibility, again, to sort of restate that the tool doesn't really tell you what the volumes and costs required will be. It's up to the DNO to make sure that the scenarios that they've defined in terms of the load growth correspond to the volumes that are going into this tab. So if there is a small amount of exceedance, so if the peak load is just brushing over the capacity of the substation, that will correspond to a certain flexibility requirement. And actually, the flexibility requirement will also depend on how procurement is done. So this tool is not answering that question, but you just need to populate it with meaningful, sensible numbers. So what we're going to do is put in an availability price and utilization price for flexibility as an input. We'll come back at the end, sort of whether doing that the other way around and figuring out what an appropriate price would be. But for this pass, we're going to say there is an input availability price and utilization price, and that's an average price across the procurement that the DNO believes they can achieve. There's going to be probably some fixed costs associated with flexibility, either upfront or on an annual or an ongoing basis. And then there's going to be variable costs that are related to this input price. So you have your input price and you have your input volumes. You're going to have a volume of availability, which is here expressed in terms of the capacity, sort of the maximum volume of flex required, and how many hours across the year that's required. And you're going to have a separate input for utilization volumes as well. These are going to have to be estimated by the DNO based on their experience of procurement and also the terms of the contracts that they expect to be signing. That all then gets put together, and that just turns into, and this is summarized in this tab here, which just says what are the overall costs associated with flexibility, upfront costs and ongoing costs combined. So this is the DNO's best view of how much flexibility is going to cost over time if they were to use it on an ongoing basis. And that's really the comparison the main comparison that this tool is going to be doing. It's going to be comparing the cost that you would be incurring for conventional reinforcement, which typically will be one-off costs depending on the specific scheme, versus the ongoing cost of flexibility. There are, however, additional costs and benefits that the DNO may feel it's appropriate to take into account. And this is where this incentives and penalties tab comes in. So there is a range of possible inputs here, which can be left entirely blank. But if the DNO believes they have the basis for populating some of these, they can. So, for example, it may be that flexibility has an impact on the losses that are incurred on the network. There is complicated modeling associated with the relationship between reinforcement and losses, and also flexibility and losses, how the network's utilized, how that utilization affects load flows, not only at the distribution level, but higher up the voltage level. It's not a straightforward calculation, and this tool does not attempt to do that calculation. I think maybe Simon can talk about there is work in behind the scenes to get a better view of this. But whatever the impact is, you can put in the volumetric impact on losses, which is then translated into a cost. And there are also emissions costs and benefits associated with those losses, but also more generally, there may be a CO2 emissions impact associated with, let's say, the flexibility solution you're using may have a CO2 impact. That can be documented in here as well. And then there are other incentives or penalties that are relevant to a DNO, such as customer interruptions, customer minutes lost, and other societal factors that are all baked into the settlement that the DNOs face under their current price controls. So, as I say, often these will be left blank for want of a clear steer on what those inputs should be, but there is the opportunity to put them in, either as absolute costs or as volumes volumes of outputs. some of those are then converted into costs the DNO faces, and that tends to be based on the fixed inputs tab we have here. So this is where there's a range of inputs here, including assumptions around the grid intensity, the carbon intensity of the grid, but also things like inflation, but also things specific to the DNO, like the value of losses, costs associated with leakages, of interruptions, and some more general financial parameters that the DNO needs to use when it's evaluating a solution. So things like the capitalization rate, the WACC. These are all for the DNO to make sure they are relevant to them and are up to date given their determination. And that's really it in terms of the inputs. The only other input tab is this workings tab, which I think I said at the start is just a placeholder that allows the DNOs to document anything to do with the assumptions they are making. So a key assumption may well be what assumptions they're making in terms of flexibility procurement, what basis they have for making that assumption, and maybe some sensitivities around that. That can all be documented here. It's not necessary, but it's probably good practice so that when subsequently somebody comes to understand what went into the model, they can interrogate this sheet and understand it. Okay, so that's it in terms of the inputs. I'll pause there just in case there are any burning questions. Otherwise, we'll look at some of the outputs.
Yeah, there's a question. Chris, if you just bear with me, I'll just leaped off screen. Can you have a strategy that is flexibility followed by reinforcement, depending how growth develops, to pick up on the real options value? So this is setting you up for the next section, really. It
is rather, yeah. We'll certainly talk that through, and the short answer is yes. And I'll in the next section I'll sort of talk through how the model thinks about flexibility, and it's certainly not a one or the other. We're often talking about flexibility combined with a reinforcement at some point in the future.
And this second question is, does the tool bring in any SROI? I'm sure that means something to some people, for example, where energy efficiency is a clear option, or is it one for the DNOs to input in the free text area?
Sorry, so you cut out at the crucial moment when you said an acronym. I'm trying to figure out what that was.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the acronym is. I think it's social return on investment. So does the tool bring in any social return on investment, for example, where energy efficiency is a clear option? Or is it one for the DNOs?
Yeah, so I guess it comes back to that original point that this is deliberately only a DNO, only has a DNO perspective on it. So if there are wider benefits that are associated with efficiency, for example, this model will deliberately not include them. But there is a corresponding whole system model that we won't get into now that can account for those societal benefits more broadly. So yeah, I think the short answer is no. We only consider efficiency to the extent that it delivers a saving to the DNO and its customers, not at the wider benefits of efficiency itself.
Okay, thanks, Chris. No more.
Okay.
So you're free to continue.
Lovely. Okay, so onto the first results tab. I'll say it again, these are dummy numbers, so don't necessarily take any of the absolute numbers too literally or the differences between the scenarios. But and we've sort of deliberately chosen some quite extreme numbers to make it clear what's going on. So I may need to zoom in here. I'm not sure how clearly it's coming across, but so what the tool does, so it takes each scenario independently of the other. So if we just look at the what we're calling the best view, so this is sort of perhaps what would have been the scenario that was going into the DNO's projections before we had this multi-scenario tool. Now, what this is saying is each of these numbers is working out for a number of years of flexibility, what the overall benefit associated with using flexibility for that number of years is. So, for example, remember we're talking about, in this particular use case, we're talking about considering reinforcement as a requirement and using flexibility to defer that by a certain number of years. And what this model doesn't do is it doesn't presuppose what the correct number of years is. It cycles through different numbers of years and works out the benefit of deferring by that number of years. So, for example, what this is saying under the best view is that you can get the maximum benefit, so the maximum net present value, by deferring that reinforcement for 2 years in this case. So in this case, that's the maximum number, the maximum MPV you can get. If you defer by more than 2 years in this case, the net present value starts to go down. So what this is saying is, if the best view, if you knew up front that the best view whether the scenario we're going to be under, then using flexibility for 2 years makes sense. And after 2 years, you should then reinforce. So I think that maybe relates to the previous question. That is, we are assuming that reinforcement is coming on the back of doing flexibility for a certain amount of time. And in a low growth scenario, that's likely to be the way of things, because when you've only just had a small exceedance, the amount of flexibility you need to procure tends to be quite small. But as load continues to grow, the exceedance on a substation grows correspondingly, and you need to procure more flexibility to keep your peak load within check. So that cost of flexibility tends to go up if the load is growing. So there tends to be a point at which it no longer makes sense to carry on procuring flexibility. And that's what we're seeing in this this best view here. However, there may be scenarios where things are more on a knife edge, that you're getting some growth that is then subsequently, it falls away over time. And so this is represented here in the community renewable scenario. And what we're seeing here is that not only does it make sense to defer for 2 years, it actually makes sense to carry on deferring, in this case indefinitely, until the end of the modeling horizon. Now, I suppose it's worth stating the obvious, perhaps. You don't know by definition which of these scenarios you're in when you're running this model. As I say, this is a decision-making tool that's designed to be making the decision today based on your future uncertainty. So you don't know from now whether we're going to be under the best view scenario or under community renewables or one of these other scenarios. So what the tool is designed to do is to show you under each of those scenarios what the optimal duration of flexibility would be given your input assumptions. But it also lets you see what should be your procurement strategy. So it might be, for example, that you don't necessarily want to procure for 2 years up front, because there would be scenarios in which that procurement would be not the optimal solution. So depending on what kind of procurement strategy a DNO has, they may choose to procure for 1 year and then wait and see. So it's perfectly possible that a DNO can procure 1 year of flexibility, see which scenarios it has outturned, and then either decide to reinforce or to continue to procure additional flexibility. And I think the way we would imagine this being used in practice is you would do that once today, and then in 12 months' time, you repeat the exercise. And so there's this evolving view with new scenarios each year as you go through the process. So I think that gives you an idea of sort of how you're dealing with uncertainty, and how the DNOs might be thinking about procurement strategies given that uncertainty. So just to be clear on what these tables are, so this is the cumulative benefit. So this is the benefit of deferring by 2 years under these different scenarios, say. The next table down is the marginal benefit. So that's saying what's the benefit of deferring from year 1 to year 2. So we should be seeing positive numbers if it makes sense to do so, and negative numbers if it doesn't make sense to do so. And then these final two are just getting back to this point that says, just because it makes sense to procure for 2 years under the best view, it doesn't mean I shouldn't just procure for 1 year at first and then leave myself the option to carry on procuring for a subsequent year. So that's probably not the clearest way of putting it, but we should make clear that distinction between how long would it make sense for me to carry on procuring flexibility versus what should I do today? How long should I lock in a flexibility contract for? And those two things aren't necessarily the same. So in terms of the Insights and Reporting tab, it's pretty much giving you the same information in its first section. It's saying, it's a summary of what we saw before. So it's saying, if, for example, the best view were to outturn, the optimal length of deferral would be 2 years. So it would make sense to procure flexibility for 2 years. If instead that were we were under the community renewable scenario, it would make sense to procure flexibility for much longer than that. In which case, once you get on your path of flexibility, you've actually got a huge upside because you can actually end up avoiding reinforcement altogether. And then there's a range of values in between. And also there are scenarios in which even 1 year of flexibility is the wrong answer because it would have been cheaper to just to reinforce. And that may well be the case. And I think probably what we're going to see as this tool is used this year by the DNOs is where those more nuanced marginal situations arise, when it's less clear whether you should or shouldn't do reinforcement at all. And that's what this sheet is intended to do. The other things on this sheet are for the DNOs to use judiciously, I suppose. They let you look across the scenarios. So everything up to this point looks at each scenario independently. So it says, if the best view were to outturn, what would have been my optimal flexibility procurement strategy? Or the same question for community renewables, the same question for consumer evolution. But as I said, we don't necessarily know upfront which of those scenarios we're going to be on. So ideally, we'd have a way of making a decision on day one that accounts for that flexibility, and it gives some indication of what the best procurement strategy would be. So there's a couple of different analyses here. If we just talk through the least worst regret method, what this is doing, it's saying, what is the least worst regret strategy I can opt for as a DNO that minimizes my worst regret? And we don't want to get into precisely what that means, but this is effectively a low risk strategy. And just for this example, what this is saying is, given all the inputs that we put in, the optimal thing to do would be to procure flexibility for 1 year. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the DNO shouldn't continue to procure flexibility for years 2, 3, 4, potentially as many as 45 years, the entire modeling horizon. But provided they can, the best thing to do is just to procure 1 year of flexibility first and leave themselves open the option to carry on procuring flexibility if the scenario that outturns indicates that it's optimal to do so. So again, it relates that it alludes to that option value notion that what flexibility is doing is giving us the ability to defer a decision, see what the world looks like in a year's time, and then make a subsequent decision either to reinforce, to do flexibility, or to do something else, which may be a strategy that emerges. So that's the least worst regret method. The weighted average method does pretty much the same thing, to be honest. It's just, rather than using a least worst regret analysis calculation, it's just done on weighted averages. So the DNO can put in some indicative probabilities that they want to assign to these scenarios, and similarly, it will give you an output that says, if you believe those probabilities, what is the strategy that gives me the best expected outcome? So very similar concept, but one's on an expected outcome basis and one's on a least worst regret basis. Both are potentially valid. There may be other ways of aggregating the numbers, but these are the two that we put into the tool. And I think time will tell sort of how the DNOs use that as part of their thinking. But it's supposed to be a guide to help them think through that uncertainty. Okay, so that's sort of it in terms of the flow from putting in availability and utilization prices, putting in volumes that you would need for flexibility, and getting a optimal strategy out. I think I alluded to the fact that you don't necessarily need to put these in because you don't necessarily know what the availability and utilization price will be in an area. And so the other way of running this model is to look at what we're calling the ceiling price. So this tab what it's intended to do is in a sense very similar to everything we just talked through, but rather than dictating what the availability and utilization price would be, you set up the model with all the inputs as you did before, in terms of what the cost of baseline reinforcement is, in terms of what the volume of flexibility you expect to need, and actually in terms of specifying the utilization price as well. But what it then does is cycles through a range of availability prices from 0 up to whatever your maximum availability price is, and it indicates for each scenario how high that availability price could go whilst flexibility is still a viable option for at least 1 year. It is all absolutely dependent on the input assumptions you make. So I don't think it should be taken as sort of an absolute answer per se, but it does at least give the DNOs an indication of, given the volumes of flexibility that would be required and given the cost of reinforcement that we're expecting, what is the range of prices that we may be interested in procuring up to. So it gives an idea of what the value of flexibility could be to the network. So that's it in terms of the outputs. In terms of running this, you just need to set everything up and run this little macro up here. I won't do it now because it takes some time to run, but it just cycles through the availability prices and populates the answer. And I think probably what we would imagine is that a DNO would go through a bit of an iterative process of market discovery, understanding what kind of volumes of availability, volumes of flexibility are out there, what kind of prices are out there, and where that flexibility is needed, and find sites where flexibility not only makes sense for the network, but can be found based on the flexibility options that are available to it. So I think that's it in terms of this model. I did mention that there are some behind the scenes tabs here, and if you're familiar with the Ofgem template, this is very much the Ofgem template, and this is what's driving the calculations in the tool. So all the calculations are done using this framework. So all costs, be they capex or opex, are given what we call TOTEX treatment. I won't go into the detail. If you're aware of it, you're aware of it. If you're not, I don't think you need to get into it particularly, but just to understand that this is how the DNOs are obliged to think about the costs and benefits associated with the strategies they employ, and so that's all in the detail here. So I will pause there. I did say that I would go through an A&M example, and I will, but perhaps before we do that, should we just pause and just check there are no questions at this point? We do have another half an hour for more detailed questions as well after that.
There's no questions in the chat, Chris.
Great. Okay, so let's just take 5 minutes just to look through an A&M example. I know we've said it a couple of times before, but let's say it again. This tool is deliberately designed to give the DNOs a view of what a strategy means in terms of their costs, their benefits, their incentives, and what they need to do in terms of themselves and their customers. It is not designed to look at the costs for third parties trying to access the network or who are affected by those network decisions. So when we're talking about A&M, for example, so active network management, we're talking about flexible connections. Quite a lot of the considerations for whether an A&M scheme is appropriate or whether an A&M particular instance of A&M is the right answer. Those costs and benefits will fall on the connecting party. That's not what this tool is intended to look at. It's only intended to look at the DNO slice of that, if you like. So just to understand that. So actually that's what it says in here. So if we were trying to use this tool to look at this situation, much of the inputs are very similar. We're looking at a connection type scenario. It's not driven by load growth. It's a connection scenario, and we're trying to compare a conventional connection with an A&M enabled connection. There is no baseline reinforcement in this scenario, and that's fine. We just leave that blank. But what we're really doing is we're comparing the costs that the DNO faces under a conventional connection versus an A&M connection. Again, these are all dummy numbers, but they should give you an idea of sort of the way that a DNO might use this to think about this problem. So let's say a conventional connection imposes some costs that aren't incurred by the connecting party. There are costs that land on the DNO themselves. And so under the conventional connection, let's say it's £100,000. Under an A&M connection, that is some reduced upfront costs. But let's say that there are an ongoing cost associated with managing that scheme. So again, we're just comparing a one-off payment versus a reduced one-off payment and ongoing costs. You will note that some of the headings here don't necessarily make perfect sense. And that sort of comes back to this point that it's designed primarily to deal with that initial use case of flexibility versus conventional network solutions. But we can use the tool to look at some of these other situations. Again, if there are specific other effects that want to be taken account of, there is the incentives and penalty space to do that. So there may be losses, there may be carbon impacts that can be accounted for in here. Fixed inputs probably unchanged. And then we just need to be a bit careful how we interpret some of these charts, because some of these are not relevant. So this top chart, for example, is really about comparing the baseline with the flexibility solution. We don't have a baseline because there's no conventional reinforcement here. We're just comparing two strategies. So as far as the model is concerned, two flexibility strategies, but this is conventional reinforcement, or conventional connection, I should say, versus an A&M connection. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we're looking at is an upfront cost translates into a larger cost under the conventional solution, which means that A&M has a positive NPV. But the way to interpret this is to say by 15 years. So if there's an ongoing A&M cost that endures for 15 years, the net present value of that flips from favoring the conventional solution to favoring the A&M solution to favoring the conventional connection solution. So I won't kind of go into all the details of those numbers because they are dummy numbers, but I hope that gives some indication of how the tool might be used by the DNOs to evaluate one type of A&M decision they want to make. But I would emphasize again that there is obviously a bigger question about something like A&M that affects the connecting parties and maybe the wider system, that this tool is not deliberately not trying to answer. It is just the DNO lens. But there are other tools that may be more suited to that. I think I'm going to stop there. That's probably my time, and we want to have enough time for any other questions. So shall I hand back to you, Simon, to see what we're doing?
Well, there was a question, Chris, that came through relating to A&M, and I think you really covered it in the last few sentences. It says, under which scenario wouldn't A&M come on top if the third party's costs are not taken into account? I understand the use of the tool on an investment decision, but it seems like the assessment is not deep enough for A&M versus traditional assessment. And I think it comes back to the whole system CBA, which was developed under Workstream 4, which Beringer helped develop, is probably a much better tool to do that wider assessment of what the third party's costs are rather than this particular tool.
Yes. Yeah, as I say, that was a deliberate decision, and it partly comes back to the fact that all of this tool goes through this off-gem logic, and this off-gem logic is designed to reflect the costs and benefits that the DNO faces. So it is not appropriate to try to replicate third-party costs through this tool for that very reason. You know, the TOTEX treatment, for example, is extremely tied to the DNO's logic, but there is a whole systems tool that can give that bigger picture. So we're definitely not saying that isn't an important consideration. It's just not one that this tool is designed to look at.
Okay, great. We've got a series of questions coming in, so I think it's probably sensible, Emily, that we move to the Q&A session now, unless there's opportunity for anyone to ask any particular questions of Chris.
It looks like there was one specific question there on the model that says, could you elaborate on the flex costs inputs tab? What kind of details are needed? Would availability and utilization costs be needed? That's quite specific to the tool itself. And then we can come back, I think, to the other questions before that.
Sure. So as far as the mechanics of the tool go, it needs to know what the DNO's expected annual cost associated with flexibility would be. How the tool gets there matters less. So as I think I said earlier, there are two ways of inputting this. You can either put in the volumes of flexibility and the cost of flexibility, or you can just go straight in there and put in the annual cost of flexibility that you believe as a DNO aligns to your scenarios. But there isn't really a way around the fact that you need to make some estimate of what it's going to cost to procure flexibility, which really means an availability price and a utilization price, or one or the other. And we do appreciate there are other ways. There are other ways of procuring flexibility that don't necessarily completely marry to this. But really, what we're looking for is an annual cost of flexibility. And if you don't know what that would be, it's obviously hard to make an evaluation. So there will need to be some iteration, perhaps using the ceiling price analysis to understand the range of possible numbers, and some market analysis to understand what kind of prices are out there and what's reasonable. But it's going to be used in conjunction with a procurement exercise, I think, would be our assumption.
Okay, great. Shall we then move to Emily? Are you going to drive the questions, and then between the three of us, we will answer them?
Yep, so we're now just into more of a generic Q&A section. So if we've covered all of the questions, did we answer the question from Fernando? How do you capture and quantify the willingness of parties to enter into flexible connections?
We didn't, but we can address it now, Emily. So the choice is the connecting party. The DNOs will offer both flexible connections and all the alternative type connections that they each individually offer, and it will be down to the connecting party to make that choice. The tool isn't designed to think about the willingness or quantify the willingness of the individual parties to enter into a flex connection. That is solely down to the connecting party.
And then I believe we had a couple of questions from Gregory that we're yet to answer. So under which scenario wouldn't A&M come on top if the third party's costs are not taken into account? I understand the use of the tool on an investment decision, but it seems like oh no, we've covered that one, haven't we?
Yep.
And moving on to Caroline's question. So sorry if you mentioned this and I missed it, but this only addresses the A&M versus traditional reinforcement. Is there any way to consider A&M against other flexibility solutions?
So shall I go, Chris? Because you're looking as if you were thinking.
I was.
In principle, yes. I don't think as a product team, with the assistance of Beringer, that we've actually thought about how we would do it, but we believe the tool is flexible enough to consider that option. We just haven't got round. In the use cases, we didn't consider that as a use case that we would put together and include as part of the pack. But maybe that's one of the things that we need to think about moving forward, is what are the other different types of, I guess, options would we consider and provide use cases for, so everyone could see how the tool could potentially be used.
Okay. And then another question from Gregory. Is the idea that the CEM would be used by the relevant DNO connection departments, on whether they should be offering A&M versus traditional reinforcement?
So as the only DNO in the room, I probably should try and handle that one, shouldn't I? I think the answer, particularly for the company that I work for, Emily, is no. We will be using the CHEM tool in collaboration with our own ROCPA tool that Electricity Northwest has developed for the understanding of how flexibility can be used as an option to mitigate the need for traditional reinforcement. I can't really speak for all of the other DNOs, but I suspect that at the moment the CHEM tool will primarily be kept and utilised by the DNOs to do that primary use case evaluation, which is flexibility against traditional reinforcement. Although I must admit, I am beginning to see some questions from our stakeholders on how energy efficiency can be evaluated with this tool. So I'm not ruling out that it will be used as experience gets better. It will be used in more non-flex arrangements, but no, I don't see at the moment that it will be used by connection departments to do that A&M versus traditional reinforcement.
Thank you, Simon. I hope that answers your question, Gregory. Other than that, it looks like we've covered all the questions so far. So what I would say is, everyone, please do feel free to put in any more questions into the chat. And Simon, it might be worth us just kind of going through next steps if that prompts anything else. Yeah,
so I think the way that the product team and the steering group under Open Networks have developed this tool is this is literally the first stage. What we've created is a baseline methodology and tool that we recognize that will develop over time as we become more experienced in its use and we find different use cases for it to be applied against. And because of that, we are putting an open governance wrapper around the methodology and the tool. And as I said in my initial introduction, that later on this year that we'll be setting up a user forum, and we'll be probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks, we'll be looking for nominations for parties to join that, because we are really looking for how the tool can be used in the future, how it should be developed, have we got the methodology right, all of those questions of have we got the right tool for the job that we're trying to employ it against. And we'd like as many views and engagement as possible as part of its ongoing development.
Great, we've just had a couple more questions through. So Pete asks, is network investment also driven by asset management and supply resilience? Are these influencing factors taken into consideration?
Shall I have a stab at that, Simon?
Yes, because yeah, I'm getting a bit, I'm answering too many questions, so let's share the pain, Chris.
So as with a lot of the inputs to the tool, you need to put in sensible assumptions. So you need to make assumptions about what flexibility volumes are available, and if you're putting in volumes that can't be achieved in the market, then it's not going to give you a sensible answer. But the same goes on the reinforcement side, and we were thinking when we were building the tool about interactions, for example, between load-related reinforcement and health-related replacement. And there may well be real-world interactions there that need to be sort of thought through when building the tool. So you might, for example, decide to use flexibility to defer reinforcement for a couple of years, but then you run up against a health-related requirement to replace that asset. And that could be a very interesting use case where you're actually bringing about efficiency for the DNO by aligning your work plan and bringing down costs in that way. Now, that's not something we've explicitly built into the tool per se, although there is the ability to sort of add a drop dead date, which I didn't touch on. But definitely, I think what we would expect to see is that the tool gets used in quite a nuanced way by the DNOs, and over the course of the next year, we may well see subtle differences in how it's being used, and how it's being used for ED2 planning, for example. So yes, I think, as with a lot of these, the answer is yes in principle, but we sort of need to see how it gets used in practice.
Thank you, Chris. A question from Fernando. Could you elaborate on the way the tool could be used to compare A&M versus alternative options, where when there is no way to quantify whether DNOs will be successful in securing flexible connection contracts to cover a given connection capacity?
That's a really good question. And I don't think there is a simple answer to that really quite complex question. We do know A&M is being employed by all of the DNOs, or different forms of A&M has been applied across the whole GB estate. We also recognise that flexibility as an option is developing, that the market for purchasing flexibility is nowhere near as large and as liquid as we'd like to see. Part of the work that we're doing under this common evaluation methodology is to, which today's session proves, is to show people how we will be evaluating the various different options, and therefore give some comfort that there is transparency, and we're not just picking traditional solutions, that we are actually evaluating what the options are, including flexibility. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that particular question. The alternative options are flexibility, innovative solutions, traditional reinforcement, energy efficiency. There are a handful of different things that we can do. If we can signal to the market early on that we have a network need in an area, and go out to try and find flexibility or energy efficiency, or even people to be flexible in their arrangements that are already connected, that just means that we have more of an opportunity to try and build that flexible market. How A&M and flexible connections and flexibility fits together is something that it's not really in the realms of this product, but the Open Networks is trying to get its head around how all of these complex things work together. And is there a right answer, or is there a number of things that we can do? But it strikes me that transparency of decision making is a really important thing for the whole of the industry to see, so they get the comfort that we are making the appropriate decisions for our customers.
Thank you, Simon. Just one further question from David. Many questions about applications seem to come down to a best practice evolving about when, where, how it is used versus whole systems. Where will this best practice live and become visible, transparent, etc.? And then he's just added another line, especially important if nuanced use is anticipated.
That's another really difficult question. So I'll have a go at see if I can answer it. The whole world of DSO is not fully written yet, and we are, as the DNOs, on a journey of understanding what is DSO, what are the activities, what are the functions, and how should they be performed. The Open Networks project has been a really great collaborative piece of work, an ongoing piece of work, to try and develop the open, transparent decision making and the common tools that the DNOs will use when making investment decisions. The tool starts off with there is an investment need already defined, and Chris quite ably talked us through, well, how do you then, once you have defined a need, consider the options or evaluate the options that are presented. One of the pieces of work that will be dealt with or is being dealt with under the 1B work stream is what are the forecasting techniques and what are the network planning solutions that are applied. So there is commonality in the way that the DNOs both forecast and then indicate that there is a network need. So it's trying to, from a systems perspective, make sure that all of the activities that a DNO does is common and transparent to the rest of the industry. At the moment, this tool doesn't really pick up, as Chris described quite ably, that all of the whole system type costs, but there is a recently developed whole system CBA, and at the moment, that would be the tool from a whole systems perspective that would be used to do the evaluation. You know, we set off with a very clear idea that the common evaluation methodology would be just the DNO's own costs and benefits. I think we've still got a long way to go to make sure that we've both got consistent and whole system thinking and whole system outcomes as a group of DNOs that is aligned with the ESO as well.
Thank you for that, Simon. And there are no further questions. However, Fernando's just said thank you for the answer. I agree, DNOs and GB are leading this work in the world and transparency is key. It would be beneficial to have a methodology to measure market depth for the various flexibility options to integrate to the CEM tool. So that's just a comment for us.
Great. Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think there is currently no measure to how liquid or how large or how the growth of the flexibility market is. And I think we do need to think collectively as an industry about how we are helping develop, you know, flexibility providers, give the ESO and the DSO solutions.
Yeah, and the market depth point is interesting and really important. And I think network planners are going to have to think about the risk associated with flexibility, and that thinking will have to evolve, because there is a potential that you lock yourself into a reliance on flexibility that in some sense is you can't see the future relating to it. You don't know where that market's going to evolve to. But I think that is something that network planners are aware of and are looking at developing an understanding of how that risk evolves. And in a sense, the scenario-based approach lets you look at that. It lets you look at not only DFES scenarios, say, but it lets you look at, well, let's consider a scenario in which the market for flexibility doesn't evolve as we expect it to. So we're forced down a different path, whether that's calling on reinforcement earlier than we otherwise would have liked to do, or going for higher cost flexibility solutions because you were forced down that path. I think this is quite a nascent tool, a nascent market, and that understanding is going to evolve. I think that's inevitable.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the Q&As for today. However, what I'll do is just pop the Open Networks email address into the chat. If anyone has any further questions at all, feel free to email us and we can pass them on to the relevant person. So, Simon, Chris and Mary, was there anything else you'd like to cover off, any additional information before we wrap things up?
There's a couple of things I was going to pick up, Emily. Chris, when he did his one of the tabs, mentioned losses. There is a losses tool or losses calculation tool which is included as part of the materials, which is the default methodology that the DNOs agreed that they would use or use as a minimum when they were calculating the losses for the impact of using flexibility or traditional reinforcement. So when I use the term default, what I really mean is the DNOs have agreed to use that or something which is a bit more sophisticated. But when they are making the decision, and describing what the calculation for losses are, they would write that information in the various boxes that Chris highlighted in his presentation. So that covers off the losses point. The second point is Ofgem has recently just published the whole systems license condition, which will be applying to the DNOs and to the ESO. I've yet to read it. It is still out. It's still as part of the statutory consultation, but I'm fully expecting that things will become clearer on what the expectations are for the various parties, the various licensees, about what's expected as far as whole system outcomes are concerned. And therefore, that may guide the way that the CHEM tool is developed and the methodology is developed over time. But so I guess it's a bit of watch this space. And then the third thing I wanted to pick up is very, very clear in both mine and Chris's presentation that the tool is built around the Ofgem ED1 CBA. We have recently had the Ofgem ED2 CBA as part of the price control submission. So Ofgem have done their normal thing of providing a new template. At some point in the future, what we'll need to do is update the tool that we've currently got with the ED2, but that will be nearer as we get nearer to ED2. It won't be done tomorrow, let's say, but we'll need to, it's on the horizon of something that we'll need to update the tool to make sure it's ready for ED2. So they were the three things I just wanted to pick up. And then the last thing, sorry Emily, was just to thank Chris and Mary for their continued support for the product team. They've been fantastic. I think the tool is really good. And I can't praise Beringa enough for the work that they've done in developing the tool. They've been absolutely fantastic. So a big thank you from me on behalf of the product team.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Chris, Mary, did you have any final additions or thoughts before we close down?
I did have one, and Chris, this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but I know that there were a couple points at which we did mention the whole system CBA. I know this is the SEM webinar. I wonder if it's just doing a 30-second spiel on just differentiating the two a little bit, and what the kind of the main uses for them would be, just so there's kind of clarity on the difference between them. Would you be okay to give a 30-second update, given you were working on that as well?
Yeah, sure. So as we've said multiple times now, the SEM or CHEM, whatever we're calling it, is a DNO-focused tool. It's designed to assess the merits of a particular decision, or weighing up two or three more options from the perspective of the DNO. The whole system tool, the outputs from the SEM can very easily be placed into the whole system tool. We've deliberately designed it to allow integration between the two. So I think what we would imagine happening is that these kind of decisions get a subset of those decisions get put into the whole system tool. But then what the whole system tool lets you do is say, not only what are the pros and cons for a particular DNO, but there may be multiple DNOs involved in a scheme. There may be local authorities. There's likely to be ESO implications. There may be third parties who are not regulated assets at all. Any number of different types of organizations may be part of a decision or a broader strategy for some sort of local authority scheme that has a bearing on the distribution network, say. And what it allows you to do is to lay out the pros and cons for each of those parties using their particular regulatory framework or commercial framework, whatever the particular financials are, and get an overall picture that reflects the pros and cons for those individuals and wider society. So things like carbon emissions, things like pollution can all be baked into that model. So in a sense, it's more complicated, but in another sense, it's simpler. So it's not a question of let's all move to the whole system model. There are advantages of each, and I think as these models get used over the coming months, we will understand better where they are best suited to be used and what questions are best addressed using each. And I think that's true for National Grid as well. They've got their own models for assessing decisions, and they also have the whole system model, we will see how that plays out. But they aren't the same. They are related, and they should play nicely together, but we need to see how that plays out. And yes, maybe there'll be another time to talk in more detail about the whole system model, but thanks, Mary.
But I don't think there's anything else from us other than that, Emily. So thank you.
Yeah, nothing more from me.
Great. We've just had, seeing as we have got a few more minutes left, we've just had one final question from Caroline. Will there be a separate users forum for CEM and whole systems CBA, or will both be addressed by the same forum?
At the moment, there will be a separate one for the chem tool. I'm not sure whether the whole system CBA is actually, as we would describe it, as being baselined and can be applied. I think it's still in its, although it's a final product, I think they're still working out the use cases, or how it should be applied. So at the moment, I think there will be separate. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? There may be lots of things that suggest that these two user forums become one. We'll just have to wait and see. But we're not waiting as far as the chem tool is concerned. We're wrapping our own governance around it, and we're seeking support for people to join the user forum to get involved in its development.
Thank you, Simon. And then a question from Judith, returning to Sam's initial question about energy efficiency, how might that in the end be evaluated as an alternative option to network investment? Please, given the new licence duty on promoting energy and efficiency measures as well as flex.
Shall I take the first bit then, Chris, and if you want to do the mechanics, I guess.
Sure.
Really good question. And the way I think of energy efficiency is that we have a responsibility for promoting energy efficiency. What we've been talking about in the chem tool is purchasing energy efficiency, so spending funds to obtain energy efficiency, which is different in my mind from promoting it. So we recognise as DNOs that there is this new obligation on promoting energy efficiency measures. So that could be as ranging as providing energy advice or guiding people to local authorities, lots of communication type activities as well as sharing information. But when it comes to mitigating the need for reinforcement, we would be looking to buy an energy efficiency program as an example instead of traditional reinforcement. That's the way that I look at energy efficiency as far as as part of an investment tool, as it were, or an investment program.
Yeah, and just on the mechanics of it, as far as the tool is concerned, it doesn't matter too much whether we're talking about procurement of flexibility as kind of the conventional way we've been talking about it, or procuring a demand reduction via an efficiency scheme. So I think the only mechanical difference that we baked into the tool was to reflect the possibility that if you invest in energy efficiency for a finite number of years, you may have some tail benefits. So if you've encouraged the uptake of LED lighting, for example, once you've stopped procuring that flexibility, there may well be an enduring drop in demand. So in terms of the mechanics of the tool, it doesn't much matter. But it's certainly compatible with that, and I believe we have one use case that does illustrate that example.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, both. And on that note, again, thank you to Baringa Partners and to Simon for taking the time to go through this today, and thank you for everyone for joining this session. I hope it was useful for you, and just a reminder that the email address is in the chat if you have any further questions. And other than that, we'll leave you to the rest of your afternoon. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.